Okay, we've already uh, installed our roof on our lean-to. Unfortunately, we were kind of in a hurry to do that, so we didn't do any video while we were doing that. So we're going to do a little bit of afterthoughts. Hopefully you'll be able to understand it even though it's not while we're doing it. And so one of the most important things in having a successful roof install is to make sure that your structure itself, the framing of the structure itself, is done properly, that you are square across the, you have a complete square or a rectangular. Basically, it's the 90-degree angles of each other, so that when you install your roof, because your roof, if you're using metal roofing, it's going to be square. And so if your structure isn't square, you're going to see that it's off whenever you install your roofing. So if you look along the front overhang of this roof here, and you look at this metal relative to this furring strip, you can see, I hope you can see, that it's about the same length. It's consistent across the front and back, which means that this structure is square, at least from the front, as far as the front, this piece right here going across, and the back ledger board going across, that they're square. If they were not square, then you would either have to, what we call cheat, and I'll show you what that means, cheat this metal. I have to bring it out or push it in, depending upon if I'm going left or right, because it wouldn't stay consistent. You can see it's consistent. Another thing is, if the front and back are square, if you're doing your rafters, then you can take, if you're taking consistent dimensions, I did my rafters on 2-foot centers. So I just went from the far left across the right, 2-foot centers. Did the same thing here, starting from here, 2-foot centers across here, and then I also checked it with a square. You can use a general carpenter square or a speed square to make sure, and I just checked it on the first one. And if I know that that's square, well, I will be able to tell if it's out of square when I install that metal. If you can see this rafter, and you can see this rib of the metal, that the rafter and the rib, the distance between the two is staying consistent. It's not like this rib is going across that, they're running parallel with each other. So we know that my rafters are also square, and that my outside rafter and my other outside rafter are square, because the overhang to the outside is consistent with the overhang to this outside. So I want to also talk a little bit about the tools that you might need if you're going to be installing a metal roof. Of course, just general, like tape measure, pencil. There are different types of metal shears, and the handles are colored, and those colors mean something. I can't remember exactly. Some of them means it's a left-hand cut, a right-hand cut, and then you have the yellow handle, which has certain indication. And I don't know if these are ripping cuts. A rip cut is when you're going the length of the sheet. A cross cut is when you're going across the sheet. I like to use these electric, so we'll call them nibblers, but metal shears when I'm making a longer ripping cut. It's kind of hard to make a ripping cut on the metal because there's just so much tension between the pieces. It's hard to get your shears in there, and so this actually cuts us a larger kerf out of the metal. Just makes it a lot easier. But if you can't afford one of these, you can actually get ripping metal shears that will work okay. And then because it's hard to go over the ribs with a nibbler or with this electric shears, it's kind of hard to get those angles. I actually prefer to make my cross cuts with just with some shears like this. And of course, then I'll measure it out and I'll mark two sides, and I'll usually use a 4-foot level and just make a little line across, so when I make my cross cuts, they're parallel, or they're straight. So what I did right here is I took a couple boards and put them together and formed a right triangle or right angle, which would indicate that this board, imagine this is the beam, the sill beam to the outside of the roof, and then this would be like a sill plate, or like the outside rafter. And so as it's sitting on the front and the back, as long as everything's square, you'll see that, and we wouldn't want the metal to be flush with that, we would actually want overhang. But just so you can see that the metal and the board are flush with each other, as is the case with this outside edge. So if the front sill beam is out of square with the back, then I'm going to show you what it would do. So I'm just going to make this be out of square. So now this would be out of square, and you can see that as this is going across, there's a gain on this board relative to this piece of metal. So in order to have the proper overhang, you would have to cheat like that. And so then the next piece of metal, because it's still gaining this way, you have to cheat it a little bit more. So then the second piece of metal, as it's overlapping here, is going to be sticking out, and then it's going to come across, so it's keeping, so it looks, and you want to cheat on the front side so it looks right, and so you have the proper overhang, but you're going to notice there'll be a gap on the back side, and that's where even having a transition piece will help out, because then you can conceal that. So if this part was right, but then this board or a rafter was out, that when this, even though this would be flush on the end here, you'll see that it doesn't have the right coverage there. So if you could have a whole structure that's kind of angled, and when you do something like that, you can either run it flush anyway, and then just when you get to the outside, you can just trim off the outside edge, or you can also cheat it a little bit to where it's angled just a little bit. My preference is in a situation like that I like to make it run flush with the front, and then I would just trim the outside edge so that at least you can't detect the difference, because the distance from the rafter to the outside of the metal is consistent, even though you had to cut the metal. And so sometimes you can even, like on this end, as we were working our way from that side to this side and we got to this end, we just decided to go ahead and install the last sheet, and there's too much metal overhanging from the outside edge of the furring strips. And you don't want too much metal, whether it's overhanging too much off the front face of the building or the outside, because wind and or snow, the wind load, snow load could really cause a problem right there. But if you have a lot overhanging that's not secured, the wind could grab it and just rip this metal right off. So we'll just come in and mark it to where it just has maybe 3 inches overhanging the outside edge of the furring strips, and I'll just use those ripping shears, which is the nibblers, and cut it right off, and it'll look just fine. So, and here's another final little note. I've mentioned the transition piece. Some people call it flashing. I don't know if you can see that back here. And anytime you're attaching to an existing structure, then there will be a gap at the back that water can actually drip down and come into where you're trying to cover and cause things to get wet. So you use a transition piece, and so it would just go under. You know, of course, this is going to go on top of the metal, but it would go under, which I'm not going to be able to get it to go under there right now, but it would go under, of course. It can't just sit really to the outside unless you use a lot of neoprene or silicone or something like that to seal it off. But it's designed to go up under, of course, and then set on top of the metal. That way, as the water comes down, it would just flow. It would flow over this and then out onto your roofing metal. So that pretty much wraps up our lean-to shelter. You can already see that it's accomplishing the task for which we built it. We're able to keep stuff out of the elements, out of the rain. And I hope this helps you, because learning how to do at least some basic constructions, have some basic construction skills, will help you greatly on your homestead.